How you doing, everyone? And welcome to Dreadnought Gundam and More on PS4. And this is a little thought exercise I wanted to do. This has come up in quite a few conversations I've had with other Dreadnought and Dreadnought lore fans, and I am currently working on a condensed Dreadnought lore video for everybody, as well as a little video I'm calling Basic Batch, in which we'll show the current meta and basic builds that you can build upon and modify to make a build for your favorite ships that's right for you, but just some of the common builds on many ships. I thought I would take a little bit of a break from replays, and I do have some on the back burner I am going to post, especially ones revolving around the artillery pod and the tactical cruiser heel ball. But in the meantime, I thought I would do this fun little video that I've wanted to do for a while, and that is about how many crew members do these ships we play with have. And there's a lot to go on in the lore and in some of the commercials for Dreadnought and some of the media for Dreadnought, but there's also a lot to go on that we can draw from basic military crew for our current naval history, and there's also other science fiction works that we can take and borrow from to determine about how many crew members do these ships have, especially since if you're playing the game, we have a lot of ships exploding per match, and then if you dive into the lore, you discover not just now in the lore in the current time of the Dreadnought lore, but in Dreadnought's past, especially during the Great Solar War, where humanity fought against the transhumans. Ships were being produced in the tens of thousands, and these ships were being destroyed often. So what are we talking about when we say how much crew or how many people are on these ships? Especially because during the Solar War, or the great navies of the three great powers of the Dreadnought solar system, which of course would be Earth, Troja, also known as Mars, and the inhabitants of Venus, the nation of Venus, which are known as Enyo. So these probably have maximum crews, and they're probably transporting Marines and VIPs and extra personnel, whereas in Sinley Bay you probably have closer to a skeleton crew or pirates, and these are probably the minimum amount of crew that we're looking at. So when I started looking at this, the first things to go on, let's start with what is actually in the lore. Now we have to take into consideration the extreme advancement in human technology when we're talking about Dreadnought. And in Dreadnought there is the holy grail of the transhumans and their technology, which of course House Oberon of the nation of Enyo, which is on Venus. They really covet this technology and they try to grab it for themselves. And of course Aquila Vector from the planet Earth also does have some aspects of transhuman technology built into their equipment. And even the kind of transphobic, xenophobic, very might equals right pro-human attitude of Troja, the Martian nation, and their main manufacturer, Jupiter Arms, this also was reportedly having to, if not take some transhuman elements during the war, design their equipment to overcome transhuman shields and to tinker with their equipment to repel the transhumans and eventually defeat them in battle. So we have to keep in mind that although the transhumans are near alien advanced civilization in their technology, after all, they were the ones that prolonged human life past 140 years on average, if you don't count people dying in battle, and they were the ones that pretty much terraformed the majority of the habitable planets and moons around habitable planets and inhabitable planets into paradises like you find on Earth, and they also served to save Earth from itself. When the transhumans were first made, the transhumans depolluted the planet and basically turned it into the ideal Eden, and on top of that solved human hunger problems with advanced farming techniques. But we have to keep in mind, as advanced as the transhumans are, the transhumans were created by humans, and that means, for the most part, many corporations, but especially Akula Vector, and that would be the Vector side of the Akula Vector company, made the transhumans that did all these wonderful, wonderful things. So we're already dealing with, I would say, Star Trek or beyond level technology. It's just that this is more of a dystopian universe, and it's not so huggy, lovey-dovey as the Earth Federation. But even when we look at Earth Federation ships, it seems like that they have a lot of crew, although we have obviously nanite repair beams on tactical cruisers, and ships will self-repair if they get a break from combat. This is in lore stuff. This isn't just like, how do we explain healing of ships? It's written in the Dreadnought lore that we have particle beams, we have beam lasers that can shift phases, we have ways of breaking nanites and other forms of defense on armor for dreadnoughts with rupture. We have way to drain shields, we have ways to bypass shields with the plasma ramp. So we're talking multi-phasic mastery of physics in the Dreadnought universe. And if we take a look at some of the screenshots and some of the videos, we are seeing that the bridge of an Akula Vector Dreadnought is actually not very big. And we see this multiple times, not just with the Akula Vector Dreadnought that is in Sinley Bay during one of the advertisement openings for Dreadnought, but also when we see the Atlantis small segment that Dreadnought put out that includes the backstory of Captain Bix, who is now, of course, heading Sinley Bay. He's kind of like the Admiral of Sinley Bay. He's more or less herding cats, but that's an entirely different story in the lore we'll get to at some other point. But we see in both of the bridges of arguably the biggest Dreadnought, maybe the Jutland and Monarch could be considered bigger as far as wider and more massive, but this is the longest ship in the game, the Akula Vector Dreadnoughts. And we see the bridge has room for the captain. It's very compact, and it has room for about, I count, 6 officers and 1 guard outside the door. And we see that if you compare the bridge, it's probably a little bigger than the center section of a Corvette. So already we're getting a sense of the size of scale. And also in this video, we can see that the workers are probably half as tall, maybe a little more than half as tall as the plasma broadside guns, the individual plasma broadside guns. So we're talking about ships that are fairly compact, and you'll see this in Firefly, that intellectual property, where the actual Serenity Firefly ship is more or less like a Millennium Falcon, very similar to Star Wars, and you're dealing with a Corvette-sized ship, and it usually has a crew of 6 to 8 renegades, or less sometimes. And you're also dealing with Event Horizon, where you have kind of a frigate-style ship, maybe the size of a Jupiter Arms tactical cruiser or an artillery cruiser, and you're seeing that's a crew of about a dozen, maybe less. So we're really dealing with technologically advanced, highly advanced ships that are fairly small and built in amazing, mind-boggling numbers, and you see this across many intellectual properties. So we want to stay away from Star Wars capital ships, I think, for this. There's nothing in the lore, nothing in the commercials, nothing in anything that Greybox, Jaeger, or Dreadnought put out that indicates you're dealing with 45,000 crew members on an Imperial Star Destroyer, or a Mon Calamari cruiser. I think the scale of Star Wars is so crazy large, and actually the automation and the technology level of Star Wars isn't very high. It's almost stagnant. Same thing with Warhammer 40,000. The ships are so massive, and the technological regression or stagnation has been going on like Star Wars for thousands of years. I really think that Dreadnought surpasses these IPs, which is really amazing because Dreadnought isn't an intergalactic show or movie. It's about humanity's quest to just colonize and get their own solar system in order and livable for their huge populations on their planet. So this is what I'm going to lean towards, more of a Guardians of the Galaxy crew for a Corvette. So let's do some estimations, and I would love if people want to point things out or debate this with me in the comments. But let's start with, let's say, a Jupiter Arms Corvette, which isn't very big. In game, it's probably a little bigger than the bridge of a destroyer or a dreadnought. And we see that the actual bridge on these larger ships is fairly compact. Now, even if you're in a Corvette, you have 4 officers. You have your gunnery, navigation, engineering, and of course communication. So I think we can start with a small Corvette like Jupiter Arms. You see that there's 2 large pylons on either side of the central section of the ship, which is very small, and this obviously houses the majority of the modules and weaponry for this Corvette. And we see crew members in several official Dreadnought art pieces and artworks where you can see that the ships are still pretty darn big, but when you compare them to the maintenance crew working around it in some of these images, the ship is not as big as, let's say, a Corellian Corvette in Star Wars, or even a Star Trek like Corvette or small exploration ship. And I think that's a big thing also with Star Trek, is that although they have advanced technology, they have a lot of superfluous crew members. They have huge crew sections. They have a lot of civilians, a lot of science. It's an exploration ship meant for long-term travel, and this is not the case. So if we're saying that a Jupiter Arms Corvette probably isn't going to do a lot of long-range patrol, it's a short-range scouting and raiding craft, I think you really could get away with the captain slash commander, 4 officers to do the ship's functions, and maybe if you're a pirate you'd have 2 additional raiders. Maybe you're hot racking it where you're sharing racks. It's not a permanent sleeping station. You're not getting individual rooms. You're just getting a very small area. For Star Trek, I would think that you're dealing with the size of a runabout shuttle, which can be operated by 3 to 5 personnel and still have room for additional crew members or guests. So with something so tight, I'm really thinking that the minimum crew for a Jupiter Arms Corvette would probably be 5. Now, you'd probably have additional room as with temporary visitors, guests, or crew members on board. Maybe if it's a long-range mission, you have 2 additional crew members that are junior officers and they're learning the ropes and they can switch out when someone needs sleep. Maybe you have room for 2 Marines, maybe a small contingent of Marines or pirate scouters to board possible abandoned ships or something, or if you're taking a ship over. And then maybe you have room for a VIP if you're transporting them for some money. So really, I would say for something like Oberon or a Kula Vector may have a little more room in their ship. The minimum crew would be 5 for any sort of Corvette, and maybe a Kula Vector would have additional room for maybe 2 to 4 Marines or some guests or something. So we're really dealing with maximum capacity of probably 10 to 12 crew members for Corvettes. So let's move on to, I think, the next biggest ship. And this may be debatable, but as far as crew complement, I'm thinking artillery cruisers. Now, artillery cruisers, especially a Kula Vector, were originally designed to be long range, long mission profiles. And then we got into the Solar War where Jupiter Arms developed the backbone of the Pan-Colonial Fleet's Navy, and that was their easily mass-produced, very long-range, high firepower artillery cruiser line. And of course, Enyo entered the war with their signature ship, the pre-transhuman technology Oberon artillery cruiser line with the Furia. And this thing was very maneuverable to navigate the asteroid fields, had a small crew, long range. And so now we're getting a feel that most of the artillery cruisers are meant to be taken up by its engines, and especially its gun, its firepower. But I think you need more than 5 officers to command this vessel. If it's long range, you're probably going to need alternate crew members. And the minute you have alternate crew members and you're getting into more than 10 to 12 crew members, you're going to have to start adding things that we have in real life. And that would be a medical staff. And if you're fighting against the transhumans and are afraid of transhumans, you can't replace these crew members with transhumans. And although you have reloaders and a lot of automated systems on your ship, you are going to need extra engineers to oversee these reloaders, autoloaders, and these advanced high-powered capacitors and everything required to fire giant Tesla volts several kilometers in range. So I'm going to start by saying, if it's going to be a long-range mission and you're going to be out in space for a long time at long range shooting things, you're going to need to sleep. And you're probably going to have a medical section, a sick bay, you're probably going to have a cafeteria, and we're starting to get into the realm where you have to worry about being boarded by enemy ships, so you're going to need a small security detail. There's also docking bays. Jupiter Arms, a lot of the skins have docking bays in the under rear side of the ship, and of course Oberon ships have some of the docking bays in the front of the ship for their artillery cruisers. So right there we're getting into maybe not having a shuttle crew, but the capacity to take on supplies and to dock with shuttles. So right now I'm going to say that we have a commander and an XO. We're going to have 4 primary officers for the 4 sections of the ship: gunnery, engineering, navigation, and of course communications. So you're going to need alternate officers so that these primary officers can sleep. So right there we have 10 crew. Now with an artillery cruiser, you're probably going to have 2 additional officers for gunnery, because that's the ship's main purpose, and you're probably going to need an additional communications officer for radar work to find enemy targets with sensors. So right now we're adding at least 3 extra crew members. Then we're talking about a security detail, I would say a squad. So that's probably 5 additional crew members, bringing us up to 18. And then we have a doctor and a nurse for your bare bones medical section in the sick bay, and probably 2 dock workers for doing things like basic ship maintenance, mopping the floors, unloading shuttles as they come in, docking with shuttles. And if we add all that together, we're easily getting to a bare bones minimum crew of at least 15 to 16, maybe even 20. Maybe for pirates, they may not have a doctor, or they may not have dock workers, so maybe they're on the low end of that, of about 15 to 18. But for a fully staffed ship, we're looking at least 20 to 25. And I don't think that you could really use artillery cruisers as marine boarding platforms or for planetary or colonial assault. So I really think that we're dealing with a maximum crew. If you take on extra visitors or guests or something like that, or extra crew members, we're really topping out at 25 to 30 for artillery cruisers. Now the next size up, even though it may be smaller than an artillery cruiser, remember artillery cruisers are mainly a gun with some engines and a radar and a bridge. Let's go to tactical cruisers. Now tactical cruisers are kind of interesting because they're small and nimble. They're at least 2 to 3 times the size of a Corvette. The living space and operating space on a tactical cruiser is probably bigger than an artillery cruiser, but it's still a very, very small ship. The biggest one I would say would probably be a Kula Vector, but then again they have a lot of armor and such on there, so maybe it might also be Oberon, which is thinner skinned and has some advanced systems, but maybe they have room for more crew. I don't see a tactical cruiser doing any sort of work as far as marine invasion or taking on prisoners or whatever, but a tactical cruiser's main purpose is to either lead the convoy and be a command ship, or B, do repairs and everything, which means they're probably going to have a robust engineering crew and a very robust medical crew. So we can assume that it's definitely going to be a long range ship because it stays with the fleet for long ranges. It's not a corvette for raiding, and particularly Jupiter Arms is known for sending their tactical cruisers as convoy leaders for destroyer escorts for their mining convoys, supply convoys, and such. And some of this could take days, even weeks, for some of these convoys to get from one place to another. So we're really dealing with a long-range vessel with a lot of additional crew for repairing other ships, taking on wounded, and the like. So of course we have our basic crew of 10. We have our XO and the captain. We're going to have at least 2 communication / navigation officers, and then we're going to have at least 2 gunnery officers. We need, one for the primary and then one for an alternate so people can sleep or go on break or whatever. But then we get to engineering, and I'm going to say that tactical cruisers have a robust engineering crew. Now, many of the tactical cruiser skins, especially Oberon, Jupiter Arms, do have little cranes and little landing pads for shuttles, so we can assume that they have a fairly robust dock workers crew. I'm going to say probably 4. I'm going to say the engineering team is going to be bare minimum 4, if not 6. So then we get into some extra security, because if you're taking on wounded, possibly prisoners, you're going to need at least a security team on there. So we have a 5-member security team, 6, maybe 8, but let's go with 6 for now as far as an engineering team, and we're adding the other 8 basic crew members. So now we're getting all the way up to 20 already. And then if we add additional dock workers and everything, I'm saying that the minimum crew for a tactical cruiser would have to be 20 to 24, maybe 25 minimum. And a tactical cruiser may need to repel boarders. It's a big target, so it might even, in some cases with a Kula Vector frontline tactical cruisers, the Kula Vector is known, and it's in the lore, written in the lore, that their tactical cruisers are often on the front line, that they have to repel boarders from possible boarding actions. They need additional crew. So I'm saying a tactical cruiser, you're going to start getting up to 30 individuals for a full complement for maybe the United Earth's military. Or you could even go up to 35 or 40 if you have sick people on board, you're rescuing people. There's probably capacity for at least 40 individuals on a tactical cruiser, but I think you could get away with 25 to 30. Now we're getting into, of course, my favorite class, many people's favorite class, the destroyer. The destroyer, even though in modern naval terms, a cruiser is bigger than a destroyer, in Star Wars and many other intellectual properties, the destroyer is kind of like the cruiser, and they use the word cruiser for slightly smaller, more utilitarian ships, and that's what they've done here in Dreadnought. So if you look at destroyers, particularly Jupiter Arms and especially a Kula Vector, these destroyers are almost as big as a Dreadnought. They're anywhere from half to 3/4 of the size of a Dreadnought. These ships are definitely warships. These ships must have a medical complement. They must have additional officers, because they are doing all sorts of things. They're long-range vessels invested in combat. They're also probably expected to participate in raiding space stations and providing security for captured personnel. They're also the bare minimum ship you would want to escort a VIP, to transport a VIP or something. to a destination. You're starting to get into a warship, especially Jupiter Arms. They really love their destroyers whenever they're doing escort or transportation, guarding or attacking. Their destroyers are the mainstay, and even Aquila Vector destroyers are known to be very good escorts. They're always part of their main fleets for United Earth. So we're dealing with a larger ship. What they don't have is strike craft. However, they still, almost all the skins have some sort of landing pad on it, especially Aquila Vector and Jupiter Arms. So we're dealing with ships that take on supplies, take on people, take on prisoners, deliver VIPs via shuttle. They have robust weaponry that requires a lot of maintenance to make sure the automatic loading machines are working, to make sure all the guns are calibrated, their energy sources are working properly. And they have a lot of guns, and even though these guns may be automated, you're going to need a fairly robust gunnery crew. Their engines are huge, they have large reactors, they're going to need a real team of engineers. They're going to need, because they need to find targets and destroy them, and they're often the centerpiece of a small fleet. They're going to need a fairly good navigation and communication team. So now, and with a larger crew, you need officers for each section just to keep everyone in line, make sure discipline is a factor. And that was mentioned during the Dreadnought lore during the Solar War, that there were varying degrees of command discipline. Some were harsh, some were lenient. So now we're getting into kind of a more modern Navy where things are more structured and you have extra personnel. So you're really dealing with not just the core 10 officers if you have a long range ship, but you're going to need an officer in charge of each section, and you're going to need an XO to take over if something happens to the captain or he needs to sleep or take a meal. So we're dealing with right there your bridge crew of 5, the XO plus the heads of each section, that's 10 minimum. You're dealing probably with a full squad security detail minimum, which would be 10 individuals. Bare minimum, because the ships are larger and you could probably take on more, especially at a Aquila Vector destroyer. You could probably transport a whole company of Marines no problem. But we're just talking about ship security. With so many crew, you're going to need a robust sickbay section. So we're dealing with at least 5 individuals there. For engineering, you're probably going to have an engineering team underneath the head and backup officer of each section of probably 4 individuals. Gunnery, same thing. You could probably go light with communications and navigations. You could probably get away with 2 to 4 individuals. But I say on average for each command section you have, it's going to be 5 individuals, plus a security detail of 10 individuals. Plus you need a medical detail of 5 individuals. That's already bringing us up to 32 crew members, bare bones. And if you have other aspects of the ship as far as having a lot of landing pads or anything, you're going to need a full-on 5 crew dock worker section. And with so many things to paint, so many floors to sweep, so many the necessary equipment that goes in the ship, you're probably going to have just 5 to 10 regular crew members to just do the normal things around the ship, you know, clean the bunks, clean the rooms, do things like that. So I'm saying your bare minimum destroyer, even for something out of Sinley Bay, your bare minimum destroyer is probably going to have a crew of 40, bare minimum. Even Oberon, whose ships are halfway in between a corvette and a destroyer, even with their small ships, some of their skins have landing pads, and it's not much smaller than Jupiter Arms. And even though they're sleek and very automated and tend to do things like ramming and delivering powerful torpedoes, they're kind of like, I would guess, a submarine, what a submarine would be to a fleet today. So if you were to take a submarine and make it very advanced and automated with nanite machines, automated loaders, things like that, getting rid of a lot of the crew, 50 is not an unheard of number, especially for a diesel boat. For the Germans, they have a lot of stealth diesel submarines. We have long range submarines, but we're not very automated in the United States military. But India and China, they have a lot of highly advanced, smaller diesel submarines, and their crew is about 50. So I think 50 is a good start for a destroyer. And then if you're transporting additional Marines, they're not on there for months. They're really just filling the hallways, filling the cargo bays or whatever until they're deployed to invade a station. You could probably easily fit an additional company of 30 Marines, if not maybe a little more. You could also probably take on at least 10 prisoners, put them in the brig, and if you're doing that, of course, your home security team is going to be pretty busy. You may even want to add 5 more troops for that. So now if we take on guests, there's probably 4 to 6 guest rooms for VIPs and their entourage and everything like that. I would say that you could probably have a full functioning United Earth or Trojan Navy or Enyoan Navy vessel fully decked out. You're probably leaning more towards 60 to 70 crew, plus guests, extra Marines, and so on. And if you were in an emergency and you were taking on evacuation, refugees from something that was about to explode, or sailors from a friendly ship that was going down and you're taking on their rescue pods, you could probably max out at about 100 individuals on a destroyer. If we really look at the size and realize that there needs to be room for the modules, the jump engine, the power plant, things like that, there's probably a limit where if you stuff 100 individuals into an Oberon destroyer, they're really filling the hallways. They're really shoulder to shoulder, asses to elbows. So I think that's about maxing it out for a destroyer. But I would say 40 to 50 is typical for Sinley Bay. For an official Earth, Mars, or Venus military ship, you're probably more in the ballpark of 60 to 70 and a maximum capacity of 100. So now let's get to Dreadnoughts. Obviously, these ships are smaller than an Imperial Star Destroyer. I would argue that in the Dreadnought universe, any of the Dreadnoughts from the 3 mega corporations could give anything in Star Wars a run for its money. When you get into facing Star Trek, I would say they'd be on par, except that Star Trek ships still don't have self-repairing technology like the Borg. So Dreadnought ships do, plus they have tactical cruisers with nanite beams. So these are very advanced ships. The interesting thing we get into is that in the lore, we have Dreadnoughts being used for colonial assaults, carrying Marines. We see there's just a random Marine guarding the bridge in that little Dreadnought segment. You can see that they're pretty darn big, and they have a lot of weaponry. So again, we're going to go with that core crew of 20. It's a much bigger ship, sometimes double the length of a destroyer or almost double the length. And if not, definitely twice as wide in the case of the Monarch or the Jutland. Even the Oberon Dreadnoughts are quite bulky. Now, the other thing is that Dreadnoughts can take on Strikecraft. Now, Strikecraft are pretty advanced, but we can hear when you launch Strikecraft in the game, they are not automated drones. They actually have a pilot. Now, when you launch a full complement of fighters, it's 8 fighters. When you launch a wing of interceptors, it's 2 interceptors coming out of 1 bay. When you launch bombers, they come out in groups of 4 out of 2 bays. So I think it's safe to say that per bay you're getting 2 Strikecraft. Now that's a pilot per Strikecraft, that's 8, and you're getting the maintenance team, and no matter how much you automate a carrier, you need a maintenance team for each bay. So that's got to be at least 8 more individuals, if not 10. And of course, you're going to need a CAG, an officer in charge of the flight wing. You're going to need a head engineer in charge of the carrier maintenance facilities. So you're dealing with 20 individuals. Now, let's say you don't have Strikecraft on your Dreadnought. You're dealing with so many guns for broadsides, and you're going to need additional weapons experts for maintaining the auto loaders, making sure plasma generators aren't going to explode. And of course, if you have nuclear weapons instead of those two options on your dreadnoughts, if you know anything about modern navies, the minute you put nuclear cruise missiles on a destroyer or cruiser, the minute you put ballistic missiles onto a ballistic missile submarine, that needs a lot of nuclear weaponry experts, additional security to make sure that they don't fall into the wrong hands, or additional crew members to help load the nuclear missiles, take care of them, maintain them. So either way, I'm saying that no matter what your weapons platform on a dreadnought is, you need 20 individuals. Whether they be pilots and maintenance crew, extra security for nuclear missiles, plus extra engineers and everything for nuclear missiles, or if you have just rows and rows and rows of guns, even if they're automated in their aiming and firing, you're going to need additional crew members to maintain all those weapons. So on top of the normal gunnery officer and executive gunnery officer underneath them, so that individual can sleep, they're going to have a fairly robust gunnery crew just to aim their weapons, and then an additional 20 individuals to take care of whatever the package is that the dreadnought is carrying. So right out of the gates, we have a basic crew of 20 that we would have on the destroyers. You have the additional 20 for the main armaments of the dreadnought. You need a robust medical team, minimum 5 if not 10. Security for such a large ship, there's so many hallways, so many rooms, you're talking minimum 20. And of course, it's got a lot of little extras, like plenty of room for docking. Many of the skins have docking on there, and you're going to have, for all these Marines, you need assault shuttles, things like that, and a lot of additional dock workers. I would say 10, minimum 20. So right there, we're already getting a bare bones minimum crew. I don't think you can get out of Sinley Bay if you're a bare bones dreadnought crew without 50 individuals, and I would even say up to 20 individuals addition to that, so more like 60 or 70, just to get this ship on the road and working properly. If you're part of a major Navy power such as Earth, Mars, or Venus, you're talking about having a lot of extra Marines on board, an admiral and his command staff maybe, or additional communications officers to lead the fleet and everything. You're going to have a lot of extra normal sailors on there, a lot of extra dock workers. So I think that the main navies of the solar system in the Dreadnought universe are probably setting sail with 100 individuals. And that may sound light considering that in Star Wars, an Imperial Star Destroyer has a 45,000 individual crew. Modern navies, typically from World War II up to the modern times, battleships had about 1,000 or more crew members. But I would say in this advanced universe of Dreadnought, where ships self-repair, you have auto-loaders, you have advanced weaponry that may not need as much ammunition, I'm saying 100 individuals. Also, if you look at the size of the ship and really how small the bridge space is when you really look at it, that even at the beginning of that video we saw here, we have Bix or some other commander for an Akula Vector Dreadnought having a bridge that can barely fit 8 individuals. Maybe you can pack them like sardines in there if you have an admiral that wants to oversee everything. But really 8 individuals, and that bridge is starting to rival the size of a Jupiter Arms corvette. So it's not looking like we have a lot of room here. So I'd say 100 individuals. If you wanted to pack the hallways with Marines to help take a colony, or jam them full of pirates if you want to raid something, I think you could get away with putting on an additional 40 guests to temporarily fill the cargo bays, the beds, and the hallways for a specific mission. bringing it up to maybe 140. Maybe for a Jutland or a Monarch, you might be able to push 200 individuals, but I really think you'd be packing them in like sardines there. I think they'd be, elbow to elbow in the hallways, waiting to leave the docking bays and go invade something. So I really do believe we're dealing with a small elite crew, especially for Sinley Bay ships. But it's interesting to note that they produced these ships during the Great Solar War against the transhumans in record numbers. They were building 10,000 ships at a time, and especially the battles in the asteroid belt at the beginning of the Great Solar War were very brutal. Thousands of ships were lost. Then when you got to the end of the war and the humans were resorting to using weapons of mass destruction, they were talking about inflicting thousands of ships per weapon of mass destruction hit when they were fighting over Uranus or in some parts of Saturn. It was really a brutal fight. Losses were extremely heavy. One particular ship was recorded as taking down 56 transhuman ships. There are accounts of transhuman ships knocking out dozens of human ships. It was even the smallest engagements had heavy casualties, and keep in mind that the human war machine was always building new ships, always putting them out there. The three mega corporations were more than happy to supply new ships for the war effort, and were making quite a profit. So I think the death toll was still very high, and when we look at Star Trek would have major fleet engagements between the humans and the Borg, major fleet engagements during the Cardassian border wars or the Dominion wars. Many what they consider a major fleet engagement would be 10 on 6 during the Klingon invasion of Cardassia. Some of their biggest battles were 12 to 16 Cardassian ships versus 12 Klingon ships. It's really, unless it was a pivotal battle, you're dealing with a small amount of ships. Even in Star Wars, if you separate the Battle of Endor or the Battle of Jakku, most of the major, what were considered pivotal engagements of the Galactic Civil War in Star Wars, were dealing with a dozen ships on each side. In Dreadnought, when entire battle groups moved out against the transhumans, you're talking hundreds of ships per battle group. And some of the battles were recorded as having thousands of ships and losing many of those ships in an engagements, and the transhumans were meeting them in similar numbers, which is why the humans started resorting to weapons of mass destruction. So I think we're getting a feel for the Dreadnought universe where life is long, but life can be cheap. And there's an advancement in technology that's unprecedented, but the crews are small. But there are huge fleets, even in your team deathmatch, even in your onslaught. The typical losses before a game is complete would be at least 20 to 30 ships lost in such a small, unimportant engagement. So ships can be destroyed easy despite the technological advancement, and ships were known to have taken out dozens of ships on a simple sortie. And you're dealing with a small elite crew, very similar to what you'd see in The Expanse, what you'd see in Firefly / Serenity, what you'd see in Guardians of the Galaxy. A lot of these other IPs tend to make ships more advanced, nimble with a smaller crew, but just have tons and tons of ships. And I really think that's the feel for Dreadnought. So when you're imagining yourself going out there in these ships, imagining yourself having an elite crew in a Corvette of 5 individuals, or maybe having 50 of your buddies on a Dreadnought that's barely crude enough to make your way and join the scum of the solar system in your trek to become an outlaw. Well, that's it from me for now, and I'll see you soon in Sinley Bay.